The comedian Stephen Wright used to have a joke where he would talk about owning a map with a 1-to-1 scale. He said that he spent a whole summer unfolding it. I don't know if Wright was referencing intentionally a Jorge Luis Borges story, though I think he probably was, where the characters have the same thing. They have a map with a scale of 1 mile equal to 1 mile. And Borges was trying to make the point that that kind of map would be useless, right? He was making a commentary on science, how sometimes if you have too much data, you actually reduce the amount of information you have, you reduce the amount of knowledge. Well, let me pitch you maybe a counter-argument to what Borges was saying. Here's a map that the scale is not 1-to-1, but like 1,000-to-1, at least informationally speaking. What you're looking at is a map of Seattle, courtesy of the folks at the big construction company, Parsons Brinckerhoff, and Autodesk, the 3D computer-generated imagery company. But this isn't just a pretty 3D flyover. I mean, it is a pretty 3D flyover, but it's generated not from an artist's vision, but from the actual information that goes into building the buildings. So it's the zoning of the city, and it's the blueprints of the buildings themselves. And the surfaces are texture maps, pictures taken from the real Seattle. So what you're seeing is essentially the modern version, the virtual version of Borges's 1-to-1 map, only built inside a computer. This is, I've started to think of this as Seattletron, because this is the grid, right? I mean, this is the actual city. It's the size of the city, only it's in silico instead of in vivo where we are now. So what do they use this for? Well, Seattle's been using the map to test some of its disaster preparedness, do some evacuation modeling, and I have to admit a little dubious about this being as useful as they would hope it would be, although Parsons Brinckerhoff was very hip on the idea, because, you know, it's a simulation, and so whatever unpredictable limitations exist out in the world don't get modeled in the simulation. But they've said to me that they're still finding some things like, oh, this is where people would go, and this is what might happen to some of the structures. They're interested in rebuilding a viaduct that's part of the waterfront in Seattle, for example. So that's interesting, but it's actually not my favorite map or simulation of the city. This one is. What you're looking at now is the path of a planned tunnel underneath the city of Seattle. So those things that look like pillars floating in the air that you can see, those are actually the foundations of skyscrapers, so the tunnel's going to go under. This also has things like utilities and other tunnels that already exist in the city. So what this map does is takes real information. This is the same 1-to-1 three-dimensional map, but it's a view that no human being could ever have. Right? This is a map of the invisible city. This is a map of a city that you would never be able to see, but exists, or could exist. Well, that got me thinking. You could take one of these virtual cities, the Seattletron, and start layering on more data sets, right? We have a lot of data that comes out of cities all the time. Electronic financial transactions, GPS traces for trucks and for taxi cabs, whether a traffic light is red or green, images from traffic cams, everybody's tweets and Foursquare check-ins and Instagrams mapped to the place where they were actually taken and put up as wallpaper on the image. You can start to imagine the Seattletron becoming very place-like. You know, Lewis Carroll wrote about one of these maps too, actually. In his story, there's a country that evolves a map so sophisticated and big that eventually it's near 1-to-1, and farmers start to complain because when they're using the map, it blocks out the sun and their crops die. But what the folks in that mythical land started to do was use the country itself as a map. What I'm pitching here is if you started to add enough data to something like the Seattletron, to one of these simulations, you could start to use the map as a country, right? I mean, you could go there in a way. So I think maybe finally technology's gotten us to the place where Borges was wrong, where the 1-to-1 map, the addition of data, finally makes these maps not less usable, but more useful. It makes them real.